Okay, so the idea is that I will first give you a bit of an intro on who we are in some sense as the Forecasting Forum Scandinavia. Who am I myself as well? Some of you, or at least from the online group, I know that you've met me before. Most of you haven't, and a bit of my group as well. And then in the academic part, I will try to give you essentially three messages. The first message is when we talk about forecast, what we really mean, what is a good forecast. The second message is where are we now, essentially in terms of what's the common practice, what are the limitations, and potential ways forward. And the third part will be about looking towards the future, innovations that are happening right now in research that, at least in my view, and I would say my group's view, are very relevant to practice. Okay, so a few words about the forum. We've communicated that initially anyways, but we really see it as a discussion forum between academia and industry. And of course, I'm affiliated with Skövde University, but I don't want to make it just our group. It's a matter of more academics to join in, because that's how you get innovation and research going forward. And the same goes from industry. David has been very helpful in helping into organizing all that and bringing his ideas and so on. But we want also to hear from companies their problems, we need data to work on new innovative solutions. We want to have this as an ongoing discussion. So, initially, if we can have this discussion forum that will eventually lead to consortia of one way or another finding good ways to work between ourselves, that would be fantastic. Perhaps I can give a bit of a personal view on that, that one of the things that I find very enjoyable being now in Sweden, having a previous academic career in other countries, is that there is a very open community, let's say, in how business adopts innovative solutions and the discussion with the universities. And that's also one of the reasons why I find this is a good initiative for here. So our principle is to keep it as an open community. Ideally, we want to see the contribution coming from different members with different ideas, potentially talks for further on workshops and so on from other academics, and hopefully from other people in industry sharing their ideas, their challenges, their journeys on how they managed or potential problems they faced and so on. Okay, so I mentioned that we want to have more of this. There are two ways we see this starting as an initiative. From one hand, we have the LinkedIn group, which I think it's a good way to keep the network open, and hopefully we'll see discussion happening there, and you can join by following the link. Obviously the slides will be shared as well there, so you can download what you need from there. But we'll also plan to have a second workshop sometime in springtime. Again, we will find the relevant topic, hopefully coming from the discussion from the community or from ideas we have from our own network already. Okay, in terms of the workshop, we already had from Anette a quick breakdown, just here if you wish in print. So after my talk, there will be a short break, and then we have Alexander giving his view of the issue, and then we'll have an open discussion, picking up your online questions and your offline questions. A bit about myself. So I have a bit of a, if you wish, strange background in the sense that although now I'm a professor in predictive analytics, arguably quite a bit on AI as well, I initially started with strategic management, fully qualitative. At some point I said, maybe maths makes some sense. Then I did operational research, a master's in operational research in Lancaster in England, where I stayed on actually as an academic until I became a professor there before I joined Skövde University this year. I have a long-standing experience in forecasting research and practice. I've worked over the years in, I think, almost most sectors, with a lot of the leading companies internationally. I've been very fortunate to work in a group before that already had a good outreach, and I hope I helped a bit extend that. So I'll try to give you in my talk a bit of an experience from different sectors, distilling a bit rather than focusing on a particular style of problems. And I will try to keep the presentation without going into the technical details, but I should say that if any of the slides are interesting for further analysis, obviously ask, but almost all the slides are based on some published or working paper. So I'm happy to provide details for everything. Obviously this slide doesn't have a published paper. Okay, a few words about my group. Although the university is not in Stockholm, and personally, before I joined Swedish academia, I didn't know much of the group. I have to say I'm fantastically surprised. They are a great group doing a lot of research in AI from many different facets, as you can see here. And what I really like about the group, and it's relevant to this initiative as well, is that there is a very strong engagement with industry. So, academics can often go in their ivory towers. This group manages to have a good balance between that, and that's very enjoyable for me. You can find, again, more information if you follow the link, which, as I said, the slides will be on the LinkedIn group, so you can download them from there, and then you can follow the links. Okay, a bit on the specifics of my talk. As I said, what makes a good forecast will be my first top point, and I will try to keep it visual. I'll talk a bit about the standard approaches, what are the limitations, and then think about this external information, these leading indicators, how they can help us, and looking towards the future. All right, so starting from the very simple stuff, here is some past data, some sales, and we want to make a forecast. And typically what we would see, it will see something like that. So we'll say, fine, let's produce some estimation of, does it go up or down? Is it stable, the product we're selling? Maybe there is some slope, maybe there is some seasonality, maybe there is some special events. And eventually forecasting is all about having a very neat way to find the pattern, the shape in the past, and copy it to the future. Now, some part of it will be explainable, some part will be unexplainable, this randomness, this noise. And that's actually what makes the whole thing complicated, because, in some sense, forecasting is a great place to be, because you can always be wrong and you're still fine. Everybody would like it to be accurate, but let's face it, no forecast is accurate, professional secret. So the question is, how much can we expect actually this forecast to be spot on? We see these lines, let's say in newspapers, here is the forecast for whatever, let's say the index in the stock market, or here are the expected cases for coronavirus, or whatever case we have in the newspaper. There is a line there. Do we expect this line to ever be spot on? No, but we hope it to be around there. And the around there is actually what makes forecasting a very interesting discipline. So if we think about it, the more accurate the forecast, the less uncertainty we have about the future. The less uncertainty we have about the future, the better decision making we can do. Or at least we hope we can do. Then it's up to us at least to make the mistakes, not about the forecast. The objective in doing a good forecast, and I'm using the word good as a bit loosely defined, I'm not going to give it a statistical underpinning, is that we want to understand how much uncertainty is left in the forecast. If we say we're going to sell 1,000 units tomorrow, is it 1,000 plus minus 10 or 1,000 plus minus 1,000? So I have no idea what I'm talking about. That's really what I'm trying to figure out in saying I have a good forecast. So we need to understand a bit more what this uncertainty is. Why can't we have everything in our forecast and be very good? So as I said, if we say we're going to sell that much, suppose we're selling a product, we're not offering a service, something like that. Okay. Let's make our life a bit easier. Let's suppose that there is no seasonality, no special events, nothing there. So where does this randomness come from? Why can't we just say the number exactly? Is it because we're not competent at it, or is some other reason? Well, it turns out, if we keep it without going to the technical details, that it's all about the information we don't have. If you think about it, you don't know what your customers are doing, every one of them. You don't know, for instance, let's put it differently. I enjoy having ice creams. People who know me know that very well. So, now I'm giving here this workshop, so I'm not at a place getting an ice cream. So that's something that, of course, the people who work there don't know it. They're used to me to go after lunch for my ice cream, but today is not happening. So that information, could they know it? Maybe they could know it if I told them yesterday, but if you think about all your customers, can you have all this information? That's from one hand where the randomness comes, this lack of information. Also, your competitors will do actions. That also information you don't have, that will also increase the uncertainty. But there is also a lot of fundamental stuff we don't really understand. There is great advances in how we understand human behavior, and every day there are very interesting papers published on that matter, but there is a lot of stuff we don't understand about economy. I mean, not understanding a lot about economy is something that I think is not controversial. You just see all the economic policies collapsing every year, and that's fine. It's part of getting better understanding. But all this lack of understanding either of the fundamental structure of the information is what gives rise to this uncertainty. But that doesn't mean we have to sort of forget about it. We can still characterize it. We can still figure out, okay, that's how much uncertainty they have to deal with, given a good or a bad forecast. So again, sticking with my ice cream example, let's imagine we have some customers, and let's say we have 5 customers, and they may buy randomly from 0 to 4 ice creams. And this is what we observe. One specific day, these 5 customers, one of them buys 1 ice cream, 2 ice creams, and so on. As a store, I see a total demand of 9. Now, if I knew, for instance, that these customers, on average, they would buy with equal probability these 0 to 4 ice creams, I could say, on average, they would buy 2 ice creams, so I would expect a forecast of 10. I get a 9, not that bad. If I observe this across different days, so here would be my errors. So here I get it spot on, here a bit less, here a bit more, that's fine. If I observe this across several days, I will see something like that. I will see more and more demand coming up, and I will see a particular shape showing up about this uncertainty. I don't know if each individual customer every day will come and buy 0, 1, 2, or 3 items. And in many ways, I don't need to know that. What I need to know is how probable it is to buy 4, 10, 20, or whatever. That is how I want to see the forecasting problem. It's a probabilistic problem. It's not like I want exactly 5 units and somehow I know those 5 units. To make the analogy a bit stronger, in this particular case, I have 5 customers. On average, I expect them to buy 2. So I would expect a point forecast use of 10 units. And then around I will have uncertainty that comes from how our customers tend to buy their products. Now, that's a very simplistic example just to demonstrate where uncertainty is coming from. But of course, you can superimpose on that more complex structures, competitions, all the actions are happening in the economy, disruptions, and that distribution can very well look very strange. But that's really where we say about that the forecast is not just a single line, but it's the uncertainty around it. That's the good forecast if you use, or the complete information. So we're trying to have these 2 elements together, both the structure and this randomness. Okay, so we want to remember that there's randomness in the data. We don't want to over-explain it. It's so many times that I've been involved in discussions with industry where people say, oh, you didn't get this point by 10 units, you should adjust and so on. But if these 10 units are within randomness, it's no way you would know it. So trying to adjust one way or another, you're probably buying yourself more risk, more uncertainty, rather than actually solving your problem. And this is where the understanding the uncertainty comes into place. So to visualize that, if I would have the previous prediction as an example, what I really need to have is I need to have this bounds that tells me, you know what, on this particular period, that's how much uncertainty you expect. If you would forecast more than that, or if you would see the observed demand being more than that, then you need to think about it. But if it's very close to that, then you could say, well, look, with 90% probability, I would be around here. Now, that gives me a complete forecast, because even if I start improving it, at least I know what's my risk. That really covers to me and saying, that is the cost of my forecast. If I have to cover for all these scenarios, or if I have to have extra inventory, or whatever is the business I'm into, I need to have enough to cover these probabilities. Now, again, I'm not going into technical details because that's beyond the objective of this talk, but at least it gives you an idea of how we look at this forecasting problem. Okay, why does it matter? Well, here think about a very simple example. We have 2 products. One is more volatile, so blue line would be historical sales, red line would be your prediction. Now we can argue until whatever tomorrow if that's a good prediction or not, but I think you will agree that on average it looks fine. So suppose on this forecast I want to take a decision. If I don't count the uncertainty, I could very well go and say, right, I want to be able to cover demand for that many days. A very standard inventory policy that you find quite commonly in practice. If I do that, then essentially I would say, I want my forecast multiplied by a factor. And that's what I would get. Okay, same factor for both products. Of course, someone would say, I can get a different factor, but let's go with it for now. What do we have here? This one, here is the inventory I will keep. So fantastic, I cover all demand. I meet every expectation from my customers. Arguably, I have too much inventory though. That carries money into it. That is wasted resources. On this product, on the other hand, with that same factor, I'm about all right. I cover most of the demand and the stock seems to be about right. But if I would think about the uncertainty aspect, these forecasts as a number are identical, but they carry different uncertainty. Here is the view with the uncertainty. If I carry this uncertainty to my prediction, then I can set the inventory level based on that. Okay, so that's where forecasting becomes complete. And that's where, you know, for me, I often have to discuss, let's say, with industry, as I'm hoping this will go into the discussion elements, and people tell me, oh, I need to improve the forecast. And I'm asking, are you looking at the uncertainty? Say no. You say, well, look, we can run a project, I can take your money, but I'm not going to move the red line. It's going to be the same. And if you're taking decision on the red line, thank you for the money, but that's all. You know, if you look at the uncertainty, then we're talking. Then we can actually do great stuff. Any improvement I'm doing in your forecasting, or you know, whoever is doing an improvement in the forecasting, that actually returns then in the decision quality. And then, you know, it's your managerial aspects, if the decision is a good decision or a bad decision, but at least you take into the right information, and that's the important stuff. Okay, so how does this all come into place? Well, let's see. So, as we said, we start from the basic demand. We have some initial point forecast. We now know better. We put the uncertainty over it. That's the associated cost, as we said, the decision. But that is the very basic thinking. I'm just copying, pasting, if you wish, the pattern, the shape I saw from the past into the future. Okay, fine. Can I do better? Yes, I can do better. There is more information out there in the market. Okay, as I enrich my forecast with additional information, for instance, marketing actions. I'm sure that at least people in practice, they find this all too common and frustrating. Different departments in the company don't necessarily talk to each other. Marketing team does one thing, sales team does one thing, production team does one thing, operations does another thing, and eventually somewhere in the middle that information is lost. If I have all this information, I can improve my forecast. Suppose this is a promotional period, suppose. I can have information from the economy. Economy is doing well, economy is not doing so well. That may give me an understanding of the disposable income and so on and so on. Or for instance, I can see how my customers talk about my brand or talk about my new products or whatever. So in that sense, all this additional information can be captured in my forecast. What I really expect is that it won't change dramatically the shape of the forecast, but it will change the certainty of the forecast. That will make me able to take more precise decisions. I won't need to cover so much risk in my decision. And obviously, the thing we should never forget is that statistics, AI, whatever, model-based forecasts are great. After a point, we also have to keep in mind that experts actually have the information of the sector. They have a know-how that we shouldn't disregard. And that may lead to further adjustments. There are some questions there how we account the uncertainty of these adjustments, but that gives you a bit of a feeling of, at least as an academic, how I look at a complete forecast. I start at the basic thing, I produce my point forecast, I produce the uncertainty, and then I enrich it further and further with all the information I have on my hands to get something that is predictably useful. Again, you know, if this was the initial cost of the forecast as the uncertainty, I try to make it less expensive, if you wish. So how do we do this in practice? As I said, I'll move towards the practice. Most of the forecasting that is happening is what we call the extrapolative forecasting, which is more or less as I started my presentation with. We try to find the shape into the past and use that shape for producing forecast, filtering out all the randomness if possible. And if we think about practice, most of the software companies actually do exactly that. Open source implementations are equally same. The big majority of them is just using extrapolative models. Those of you who are more technically oriented, you may recognize ARIMA, exponential smoothing, but also artificial intelligence and so on is more or less extrapolative forecasting in most cases. Okay. Why are they so popular? Well, they're very easy to build. They only require your past history of sales or whatever is your activity anyways. They don't need extra information. That makes them very easy. And because they're models that are small, well-behaved models, they're very reliable. They don't break down so easily. And that makes them very good to implement in a wide variety of applications, very good to scale up to massive applications and automate. They don't make your life very difficult to have them running on their own, if you wish. Furthermore, they're actually quite easy to explain to people in the sense of saying, oh, that all it does, it captures the seasonal element, your promotions, suppose there are special calendar events that say, I can communicate that to an expert who doesn't have statistical knowledge. And therefore, people know what exactly the model is doing. So when they use their additional expertise, they have a feeling what they're adjusting, not just some random number that came from an arcane technique. A critique that you hear often about advanced techniques. It's a lot of matter of how you communicate the models to the users. Okay, but they all based on a very strong assumption. The assumption is that the shape of my demand is immutable in the future. I'm not looking for the fundamental forces that drive my demand. I'm just looking at the resulting shape. I expect that, for instance, if I have an upward trend, that trend will continue. If there is a break in that trend, upwards or downwards or whatever, that idea of just copying the past pattern to the future will of course not work. And a very simple example, we are in Stockholm now, so here is the data of restaurant sales year-on-year change for every particular, I think these are monthly data. No, sorry, they're quarterly data. And I have here as a red line an extrapolative forecast. I don't need to go too much details. It's a forecast that you get, a reasonable forecast that you can get. And of course, the forecast has seen a more or less stable growth over the years. It's growth, so it's a flat line. If I take it the exact sales, it will be growing up. So that's a reasonable forecast. And then coronavirus happened. Well, of course, we didn't know coronavirus happened, but once we know it happened, an extrapolative forecast doesn't know what to do with it. It is not given that information. You need to provide it additional information to your forecasting models to say, somehow I see that. It's not in my database. If my database says just take the level that you've seen in the past, potentially some upward or downward slope, and extrapolate that in the future, special events or disruptions are not part of that. And that is where the extrapolative forecasting, in a nutshell, okay, you can go much more complicated, but in a nutshell, is limited. What we need to do now is we need to enrich it with different information. I provide you here the uncertainty, and within 95% probability, the model would expect that we are within these bounds. Well, we have a drop of about, what is it? Almost 40% drop in the sales. That's a massive drop that is well beyond what our expectation of the demand would do if we did not know coronavirus is a thing. Okay, so the relevant question, and I say now because if anybody would say that, oh, you could predict the event of coronavirus, that's whatever. But once you know it's there, the question then is, how will this sales continue? When will this go back to where it should be? How long will this drop be? Or what's the shape of recovery, if you wish? That's a valid question. And there are ways we can start addressing that question. I haven't done the modeling for restaurants, so I'm not going to give you the answer to that. But the basic principles are there. The basic principles essentially would say something like that. And that's the only sort of model I'm going into some more detail, where we say the sales are some effect of whatever is happening with the pandemic, whatever is happening with the economy, if you wish to capture it, let's say, in gross domestic product, in disposable income, in unemployment, however you want to capture it. I'm not suggesting these variables are the exact variables, but gives you an idea. Or for instance, tourism. Tourism is a big thing in Stockholm, so if this picks up again, obviously that will help the service industry. So you can build a model, and essentially the model has the important component of these parameters here. I'm Greek, I'm using Greek parameters, okay, so that's how it works. So these parameters essentially capture the mechanistic effect. I'm no longer capturing a shape. I'm not saying, oh, here is a shape I can copy to the future, but I'm saying the underlying mechanics of this are based on a very strong effect, let's say, from for the pandemic, a much stronger effect potentially or hopefully from tourism, and so on. So this kind of forecast breaks down in different ways than the extrapolative. And when we have these cases of disruptions in the economy, this modeling can be quite helpful. Okay, so the principle is simple. Obviously, the execution, as you would like to, as an academic would always say, it's more complicated. We can discuss about the complications, but that's a different thing. The real question is, what variables go here? How do we know which are the important variables? How do we know that these variables are there? They're not just correlated. So I can see today, for instance, let's say that suppose tourism flows, today I can see that they're effective or ineffective to explain the demand in restaurants. But can the tourism flow, for instance, give me a prediction for the next quarter? That's a different question. It's not just being correlated, it's being predictively useful. So this is really the aspect of finding information that is leading the sales, something that is happening before your sales. If you can make this connection, and that connection may be some months, days, seconds, whatever. If your planning horizon and how further ahead these indicators are leading the event match, or hopefully the leading is even further than your planning horizon, that's useful information. If it's shorter than that, you may find the connection, but you cannot take actions on it. It's not very useful. Okay. There are some further technical details that you know, if I think a bit, I work in a university, so if I think about my students, I will give them a data set. They will know the variables. In reality, I'm not given a data set. People tell you, well, here you go. All the variables that you may wish are available. Which ones are the right ones? That's another big problem. I'll give you an example. I cannot give you the solution in a nutshell. It's far beyond the scope of the presentation, but I'll give you examples of how, for instance, this can happen in practice. And from that, we can get some understanding. This is based on a project that I work with one of my past PhD students. And what was the question here? The question was from a manufacturer. They're doing tactical forecasting, so medium to long-term forecasting. And they want to understand if on an aggregate level, their sales will go up, down, or whatever. The project was initiated essentially by the effects of the previous financial upheaval, if you wish, a decade ago or so. And what we did, we had some sort of an implementation where it said, take from the central bank, essentially, that's the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank, but the central bank, whichever, or a statistics bureau, it doesn't matter, macroeconomic indicators about the economies that you're active in. This is a multinational, so they're active in many different economies. You will have a database of all that information. Some interesting model building is happening here, and then you have models for different planning horizons, for short-term horizon, for long-term horizon, so on, recognizing that these indicators are not relevant for every single decision. Some indicators are better for long-term planning, some indicators are for short-term planning, some are useless altogether, or some are useful for all of them. And that gives you essentially a different view of forecasting. Now, this can be supplementary to your standard forecast or can replace it. It's really up to how you end up structuring your forecasting process. Okay, and thinking about the particular case, here is a graph of further out in the future in months. This is the accuracy, so we want the error. We want this to be as low as possible. The green line, so that line here is the company forecast. That's the benchmark they were using. What I have in the ETS here will be an extrapolative model, just copying past patterns, and this would be the model that uses the leading indicators. The interesting thing is that when I'm very, very close to the current case, company has a lot of information because experts can do great stuff. They have the know-how of their industry. As I go further into the future, using these leading indicators becomes much more useful. I can understand some upturns or downturns of the market. If I go too far into the future, I start losing this connection again, at least in this particular case. I cannot say that we can draw general conclusions from that, but it's also good to recognize that if you ask me to produce a forecast for 10 years ahead, I will tell you, well, your guess is as good as mine. Statistics will have their limitations, or machine learning, or whatever you use here. And that's also good to recognize. So thinking about, okay, what do you get from that? Well, if you think about this model, starting from all the potential variables and so on, you will have a list of more useful elements. And then you can take this list. It's not just about getting a good forecast, it's about understanding what are the drivers in your market. Take this list and get it back to the experts and have a discussion then. So does this give you more business insight of what affects your economy or your sales or your markets, and vice versa? If you think that something should be there, can we test it? Can we validate the expert understanding from a model-based understanding? I will not claim that one is superior to the other, because it's not. A model-based will have its different styles of limitations than the expert-based understanding. But having the two elements and, if you wish, hitting them against each other, validating each other, is going to be very useful in learning more about your market.
If I may interrupt you at this time, we have a question here from online. Is saying that in this way you use the prediction of an economical indicator to predict the sales. We use a prediction to predict something else. In this way it seems like a chicken and egg problem. What would be your response to that?
That's the whole point of having these things. I think actually this figure here is part of the answer. Because the question is, if I use, let's say, something to predict something else and something else, again, I'm based on a forecast. The idea of having a leading indicator is saying, if I use information I know up until today and not forecast anything else, can I support the target forecast? Let me try to visualize that. Suppose I have this kind of information. These are different variables that they are leading by 1 month, by 5 months, or by 12 months, as an example. Leading, I would mean, for instance, if we see, let's say, a change in sales of houses, I would expect to see some extra work done, let's say, in selling, I don't know, kitchen or whatever, fixing your house. So there is a time, like I buy now the house, it takes 3-4 months to go in the house, then I will place whatever orders I need to have people going in the house and doing the work. That's the leading indicator by 4 or 5 months, let's say. If I have this information and I want to make a forecast just 1 period ahead, I don't need to produce any forecast for these guys. That's all known information. But if I want to produce a forecast that is too far into the future, indeed, many of these indicators are not useful. Or I would need to forecast them. So if I would need to forecast them, indeed, then I have a bit of a chicken and the egg problem. I need to forecast one and forecast the other. If I look at the econometric literature, they would tell me that, look, there are models that can try to do that, but I would make it very simple and say, potentially, this may be easier to forecast than this one, than your target. If it is not, then you're not helping yourself. If it is, you may help yourself. But often, at least the way I see the problem is, some of the indicators will still stay useful. So for instance, this one has a very long leading information. I will keep the useful ones in, and the ones that are no longer certain, I will not use them in the model. And that's why before I said, I will have models for short term and models for long term. The information is not the same. So I hope that sort of addresses the question as well. See, this is being a good forecaster. I predicted the question and added a graph here. It's not all great and fine, though. There are a lot of fallacies there. I think there is one more question.
Yes, we have a follow-on there, Nikos.
Yeah.
So don't agent-based models solve the chicken and egg problem you're discussing?
I don't think there is a solution to the problem. There are many approaches that some approaches may work a bit better or a bit worse in different scenarios, but I don't think there is a solution to the problem. Because we're really talking about knowing what's happening in the future. Some models may predict a particular variable a bit better, some models may predict a particular variable a bit worse. I'm not going to claim that AI or statistics or agent-based simulation or whichever approach you're going to use, even asking, let's say, a pool of experts or whatever, it's going to give you a good or a wrong answer. It depends on the case. But I don't think that we have a solution to the problem. I mean, it's a very nice active research area. But there is a good point in that question, in that sense that we should not refrain from thinking out of the box. Because our software says just use exponential smoothing or some extrapolative method, that does not mean that that's our only option. There may be options that are better for a particular case, and agent-based simulation may be a very good approach for some cases. Okay, so, and in some sense, again, this slide shows the limitations of that as well. Having causal models, as we call them, is very comfortable because we somehow have super intelligence. We say, oh, I want to predict this, it changes because of this and this and this and this, and end up having these boards you see in the movies about detectives with all the lines and so on. That doesn't work. We have to keep our models simple, our understanding simple. We cannot do massive models. Simple, of course, needs some definition further. For some cases, simple is a few variables. Some cases, maybe hundreds of variables. But still, we're trying to abstract reality. We're not trying to have a full representation of reality. What are the key components? Because it's very pleasing to start thinking we can understand everything. The word causal is not correct. None of the statistical modeling we're doing can do causal modeling. It can do just locally predictive modeling. It may work now, it may not work in 10 years. It doesn't mean we found the true underlying process. That's still not for economics or forecasting or so on. Maybe one day we can go there, but not yet. So they can be rather dangerous because, coming back to the previous point, it's nice to say, for instance, my sales depend on weather. Tell me the weather in half a year. If it's the average weather, that's your seasonality. If it's your specific weather, an exceptionally warm or exceptionally cold summer, that I don't know half a year in advance, or I know it with a lot of uncertainty. So is that a useful variable? I don't know. If I have a model that tries to do everything, it's a very sensitive model. It has too many parameters. It can easily go wrong. I don't want models that try to do everything. I want to build a model that addresses a particular question, a particular objective. Then I can service that model. If I want a model that gives me a forecast for everything, that is a very difficult model to run. There are technical aspects. If I look at most of the implementations I find, even in very simplistic regressions, even in what we teach our students many ways, we sort of assume any variables to be known somehow. Well, the more you go into the future, the uncertainty increases, and that has to be captured. Not only in your target variable, it's uncertain, but your predictor is uncertain. Everything becomes more uncertain as you go in the future. But the real issue for me is that they give us a bit of a false sense of control. You know, think about how many times we pretend to understand the economy, and yet we're surprised, and then we say, oh, we didn't think about that. Well, that's exactly the problem with causal models. There are always elements we don't think about them. The challenge is to capture the key elements and test the model enough to know that you have done a good enough work. It will never be perfect, and that's okay. Is it practically useful? Better, you know. Is it better than not having it? Fine. It will not be perfect. We're not doing physics here. We're not finding laws of the universe yet. Maybe you know, some smart person can come and say, no, I found the way to do it. I hope so. Okay. Often you hear this discussion when you go to slightly more technical forums or in universities and so on. I can have a model for describing my market and a model for predicting my market. I don't agree with that statement. Any model that can do prediction is a model that gives you some solid explanation of that variable being useful or not. I'm not using the word causal, but a model that cannot predict is just over-explaining. In my own view, okay, that's a debatable topic. Okay, so, and this warnings, if you wish, is why extrapolative forecasting is so common. We don't have to worry about any of these problems. If I just copy a pattern in the future and the economy is running normally, things are easy. If we have things happening that are disruptive, that are innovative, then I need to think about the more complex models. Okay, I'm almost there. I'll just give you a few ideas of what these indicators could be. Now, I already provided the example of using macroeconomic information. For instance, I could say, how is the economy doing, say, you know, again, back to the coronavirus. We have now some indication of which economies are doing better or worse in terms of consumption. That may give me some forecasts, some idea for forecasts, how the European, let's say, or the American or the Asian market will behave, or the African market, and so on. Now, the idea is that, I think here there is a, yeah, okay, that should be the next slide. Apologies for that. Yes, okay. That is the next point. I'll go to that then in a second. So the macroeconomic information is obviously, as I provide also in the previous example, it's obviously a quite useful way, and it has a very strong tradition from the econometrics. Okay, there are a lot of ways that we can work on that. But the real issue is that if we have so many different variables, how do we actually pick the right one? And that's a slightly more technical question that I will try to avoid here. Other types of variables that may be useful is, for instance, looking at our customers. I think there is a question. So.
It is, Nikos. We'll dig in here from online. Nikos, do you think casual models are so popular in business due to the fact that they are much easier to be explained and to be understood by executives who may not be familiar with other type of models?
This is a very interesting question. I don't think I have a good answer to that, at least an answer I would be happy as an academic. I can have my personal view on that, which is, in some sense, I will contradict myself here. It's a matter of how you communicate the model. I think if you have a model as the one I showed previously, it's easy to explain to people. And I would even say it's intuitively pleasing because people have a bit of a better insight of the market. Obviously, if you tell me now a model with 100 variables, can I balance in my head 100 variables acting together? No, I cannot. And that's essentially also very connected with this higher adoption of artificial intelligence now in industry. Somehow we are willing to accept a bit of a black box modeling there. I don't really understand where the threshold lies. I mean, let's make it practical. When you drive a car or when you enter, let's say, a train, you don't go to the engineer and say, explain me how the engine works before I board the train. You trust that it works. But you still know the basics. You still know this will get you there. Is it the same probably with the forecasting models? I need to have an abstraction of the model and saying, this type of information is captured, and I can communicate that and understand it. But I don't need necessarily to understand all the intricacies of the model. I think it's a mistake to just go and say, here is a model, go and use it, without having the users in the loop.
It's a hugely interesting topic here, so we get tons of questions, Nikos. I'll pick another one here. It states, what would be the typical approach you would use to find the leading factors influencing the forecast in a specific company setting? And secondly, how many variables would be recommended, i.e. when should you be satisfied with the factors used?
I think that's a rather difficult question to answer generally again. I can say that at least for the case study I saw there are the published papers, and that explains the methodology we followed. But I will not claim that's the only methodology one can follow. Analytics have gone now to an era that we have fantastic tools. My preferred approach on these matters is a bit more on the statistical side, because I can still validate things. I can look at the result and I can say, okay, this happens because of this. Does it make sense? I can go back to the experts in the company and say, this is what my model gives me as an insight. Does it make sense to you, or is it completely off? I like to have this white box validation, as we call it. But that's not the only way you can do it. So for me, it would be using some sort of regularized regression and so on, if I want to go slightly more on the technical side. That doesn't preclude other ways. The previous question may suggested agent-based simulation. That's a valid way to also think about building mechanistic models of your market. Again, I would say this is based on some assumptions. As the statistical model is based, how valid are your assumptions? So I would say, at least for the case I presented, there are the papers out there. I'm very happy to share the papers for the technical details, but I cannot give a general answer because I don't think there is one yet or ever. I can say more about the size of the model, as small as possible. If a model with a few elements can capture the key aspect you need from the market, and you can validate that easily in experimental settings, then you're done. Don't try to make a model that is too super elegant and can capture everything, because that's a very dangerous model. The smaller the better always in any kind of modeling. We have any follow-up, or I can
Thank
proceed?
you.
Okay. So let's go a bit beyond this idea of using economic indicators, because this is the great thing about where we are now with so much interactivity and interconnectivity with the online and the offline world. We can see what our customers are saying. We can see how they interact with our brand. We can see how they interact with our products, and we can extract this information in many simple ways. We can, for instance, text mine comments online about a potential, how much hype is there about a new product, for instance. Or we can look how many people search for our services. I can use this information and I can produce forecasts on that. Now, the leader has been extremely optimistic on that. It's a new thing, it's an exciting thing, everybody says it works. When we look at the practicalities of reality, there is always the issue of the planning horizon. If the planning horizon is too much into the future, typically customers are not that, they're not gonna search, let's say, for buying a product. I'm not going to make a general statement, but for many consumer products, they search for something and they act on it. Or maybe within a week, maybe within a month, but not within a quarter, let's say. Some products require a quarter of research or something like that. Again, house, car, whatever. So that is essentially the limiting factor here. What's your planning horizon, and how relevant, how leading is that information? And often we find that the information is not leading enough. Where it seems to be quite promising, at least from work that we have done in my groups, is when we're thinking about launches of products. And here is just a visualization of that. Computer games, I enjoy computer games, you know, one of the other vices I have. This is how people look for a particular game, different generations of the same game. So you have the first launch, the second, third, fourth title, and so on in the series. This is how people look online for the same game. They may look online before launch, finding what it has. They may look after on launch, and so on. And this essentially says that, okay, there is some connection between these two. And we have shown, actually, if you have an effective campaign before launch, you can track the interaction with the consumers, and that can give you very valuable information about the life cycle sales that you're going to have afterwards. Point being is not necessarily that this is the information you need, but point being is that we can go much beyond just economic or macroeconomic variables. We have nowadays, this information is very easy to get, it's very easy to collect. Sometimes we even collect it actively, and you know, this is where influencers. What's exactly the effect of influencers in forecasting? Are they be a leading indicator? Are they long enough in the effect to be within our planning horizons? For some decisions, surely. For some other decisions, maybe not. And that sort of leads me to the next topic that I want to cover, which is the last thing I will say. If we think about any organization, it has multiple decisions to take. Some of the decisions are short-term, some of the decisions are long-term, strategic, and so on. Usually, as you go further in the long-term horizon, you have less certainty, less information. You're based less on model-based forecasts. You go more on, let's say, expertise, management, senior management, or outside experts, and you have fewer and much more expensive forecasts. Should I enter that market? That's an expensive decision. It's not about, should I have 10 more units in the inventory for next week. That's a different decision, okay? That's more operational. And usually in operational decisions, we have a lot more statistical methods, extrapolative methods. As we go tactical, this more regression style modeling, these indicators become much more important, strategic as well. But there is a difference in these things. And if you think about it, if this is mainly extrapolative, this is mainly based on judgment and models of leading indicators, suppose, then the information that they use is different. And then my question is, well, if I have operations being extrapolative, from the other hand, we have different information on the others, can they lead to different futures? And that's another problem we have in forecasting. Different functions in the organization, because they look at different planning horizons, different decisions, they may look at a different future of the company. And obviously, differences in the perception of where your company is going or your sales are going can cause issues. Can cause issues in waste or in lost opportunities. We need somehow to align them. And aligning for me is essentially having the same type of information included in all these different forecasts. So an approach that I have been a proponent of, if you wish, over the last few years that my research has based off is having a bit of a more hierarchical approach. So let's think about, for instance, hospitals in the coronavirus crisis. You would have multiple problem dimensions. You would say, I need to plan both locally for a particular hospital or more regionally across several hospitals in terms of having enough, let's say, beds, having enough trained personnel, having enough nurses, having enough doctors. There is an issue of, if I don't have enough, where do I train people? Do I find people? Having enough resources in terms of medicines, if possible, or any other resources we need to have that may have a short or a long lead time. If you think about this problem, that gives us a bit of a hierarchy of different questions. So you can have, from one hand, the temporal hierarchy, planning horizons that are, let's say, on a daily level, on a weekly level, on a quarterly level, or even further. But they sort of follow each other. I mean, days follow weeks, weeks follow quarters, and so on. Okay, not the full weeks and quarters here, but you get the idea. I can have also different types of cross-sectional hierarchies. From one hand, I have the hospital or a particular patient. That patient has these demands. That hospital has these demands, that region has this demand, the whole of the country has these demands. And I can also have demands on different types of stuff. Staffing decisions, training decisions, budgeting decisions on longer terms. If I use different models for all these aspects, and here I'm a bit optimistic that we use model for everything, but let's suppose we have a valid forecast for all these aspects, they will not point to the same direction. And that's where we can lose information. There are techniques that are coming out now that you can actually join these disparate forecasts into exchanging information. And I'm not going to go again in technicalities, but I'll give you a visualization of that. Here is where I have from one hand here weekly data up to annual data. And I provide two sets of forecasts. The red line would be the forecast that I would see if I only focus on the particular aspect of the data I look at. So imagine long-term planning, I would base it, let's say, on quarterly data or monthly data. Short-term planning, I need decisions intra-weekly or weekly, I would base it on this data. If I look at the red lines, they don't point to the same direction. Some are seasonal, some are non-seasonal, some are going up, some are staying stable. The blue line would be the approach that blends all the information together. So that's the other element to consider. And that's not a theoretical one. I'll give you an example where leading indicators, for instance, can be quite helpful. So if we return back to the example I had before from the case study, think about the leading indicators. They work quite easily in aggregate data, much more difficult in disaggregate data. Think about consumption of a particular stock keeping unit in a particular store. The demand is so low typically that doesn't allow us to do fantastic modeling. We can do it at an aggregate level. Demand across the region, demand of the same product everywhere, or something along those lines. But we can use a hierarchy to connect everything. We can have models with leading indicators at the more aggregate level, extrapolative or, if you wish, guessing at the lower level. And then we can connect it. What I have in this graph here is the inventory implications of using a leading indicator model for the particular case. From one hand, I have how much inventory you have to keep, and here is the kind of how much you've hit your service level. Easy answer is the point here is the best. So this curve here is the one that takes the leading indicator information from the top level and translate it to the extrapolative forecast in the bottom level. This is if I would use just the best extrapolative forecast I could get, and that could be the company case, where they are now. So what I'm trying to say is that you can build models at different levels. Some models will be more standard models. Some models we require to have this extrapolative information, this leading indicators. The real magic for me happens when you blend everything together and then you allow this information to go from both directions. It's not a top-down case that senior management or long-term planners say this is the direction everybody follows. These people are closer to the market. They have different types of information. The discussion cannot happen very seamlessly always. Organizations are massive, they're complicated things, but analytics don't have these problems. Okay, coming almost to a close. So, okay, a question before I
Yes,
close.
Nikos, prior to that conclusions, right? We have a question here. One thing that surprises is that people seem to omit the fact that hierarchical models, very popular in retail and in supply chain, are de facto casual models, since the product and location hierarchies are deciding how the forecasts are grouped and reconciled. ML and explicit casual models are then just a natural extension of that. Do you agree, Nikos?
I will say that there is a lot more to hierarchical models than that. I think that, as I said, this is where is my active research right now. So I will have a lot of opinions about hierarchical models, but indeed, some sectors and retailing is one of them because they need them more. They are much more advanced than other sectors. However, there is a lot of recent work that my group here, the group at the Monash University in Australia has been doing, that has shown fantastic innovations in terms of hierarchical forecasting that I still don't see in companies. And this is potentially one of the motivations for having this kind of interaction. There is research that is done that, I cannot blame companies for not knowing that research. That's not their job. It's our job as academics to come and do this thing and say, here are fantastic tools for you guys. And there is also the question of how easy to implement it. I mean, perhaps back to David's introduction, it's one thing for me here to say leading indicators are great and so on. It's another thing if someone asks me, okay, so how do I do it right now? Can I do it in Excel? No. Can I do it in standard ERP softwares? No. Again, with hierarchical models, standard software provide the very basics of hierarchical models that are so far behind what we can do right now. This slide I had here, this temporal hierarchies, that I'm quite proud of our innovation on this one. I haven't seen it in a software yet, and it's powerful. I mean, whenever we've tried it, it always adds additional value. So, yes, but there is more to it. I didn't give a very good answer on that one because I think it's a bit beyond the scope to go into too much detail now. But again, I'm very happy to provide the additional resources backing up these slides that will give more ideas. So to conclude, the easy point, better forecasts should lead to better decisions, or at least it gives you the chance for a better decision. What you do with it, not the forecaster's problem. It's not about getting that point forecast right. It's not about moving that line a bit further up or further down. It's about capturing the uncertainty. And you can reduce the uncertainty by enriching your forecast, the information that is in your forecast. Okay, that's the difficult part. And there is where, for instance, the way at least I see it, and I would say matches probably most of the academic view. Getting these leading indicators or this more innovative style of information is where we get the value, controlling the uncertainty. Extrapolated forecasts should not be disregarded. They're great for operations. They're great for when things are running as expected. But when things are a bit more on the long term, or things are disrupted as is now, then we need to think about these more complete models, or a different philosophy in modeling at least, and that is where the value is. So as we go at a more aggregate level, I think there is no reason not to use this type of thinking. For this aggregate level, I think the research is still not giving a good answer. Maybe industry can give a faster answer there. My last slide, hierarchical models, I think it's a very good technique to meld the information about top-down and bottom-up. I will make the optimistic comment that that's an analytics approach to solving information silos in organizations. I don't have the case study yet, so I hope at some point I will have it soon enough. And the last point, the most useful point of the whole presentation, join the discussion. Okay. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Nikos. What a great kickoff. Please stay up here on stage. Thank you so much for this kickoff from the academia and research perspective, right? Next session will be from the large global pride of Sweden, Skanska, and you get to hear from the head of analytics, Alexander Norén, after a quick break in regards to how this is applied then into the global corporate world. Prior to that, Nikos, though, there were some questions, and we'll pick up a few of them in the panel later on. I ask you this. Coming from research and academia, and we'll hear Skanska later on, right? What in your experience is what companies right now do for forecasting?
Yes, well,
in just 30 seconds or a
yes,
minute, yeah.
I mean, this is again back to the motivation for doing this work. I think the forecasting. We're now at the last few years, companies understand the value of analytics. They invest heavily on it. They are still, I think, on average, still not there in forecasting. I see a lot of mistakes happening in terms of the approach to the problem. You know, it's like saying, you know, you have to operate some heavy machinery, but when you do analytics, you don't need education. I don't think that works. But you also need the right tools, and the right tools are now being at least available because there is this push by innovative companies, innovative software houses, universities, and so on, saying we can do that stuff. And then the traditional powerhouses are a bit like, maybe we should innovate as well nowadays. Okay. In many ways, I don't blame the companies necessarily because were they given the tools? Question mark.
Okay, all right. And last one. How common is it now to use leading indicators in practice?
So from the projects I know, at least from myself,
yes.
When I think about large companies, and I'm thinking now about the very large tech companies or the very large retailers, the ones you would think about topping in the global level, they do use this kind of models. Do they use them in the full complexity? Sometimes yes, sometimes in complexity they haven't even imagined. You know, they have their R&D units as well. Are they used by the average company? Not enough, given how much value they can give you. So we actually try to run a project with my previous group, and that won't be a long answer, but I think it's useful, with my previous group in England, that to sort of figure out what is the disruption from coronavirus and how did companies react. And the thing is that most of them are still in a very high uncertainty because they're not thinking about this type of modeling. Now, I'm not going to claim that this type of modeling will solve everything. And in some sense, you know, Alexander is great to have him here because he can give the practitioner perspective. But surely there is more to trying than just saying, I have no idea. So I think there should be more of it.
Okay, I'll stop you there, Nikos. Nikos will be happy to answer more questions later on in the panel. So keep providing them online or if you have them in the room. That said, we'll take a 5-minute break now. Those of you in the room, safe distance. There's coffee and water, but safe distance. And online, 5 minutes if you want to grab a glass of water, a cup of coffee. And then we welcome up Alexander Norén and Skanska. Warm thanks.
Thank you.